how cohesive are your lesson plans? Do you feel that activities flow and connect to each other in meaningful ways, or do they sometimes feel disconnected? Today's episode is a leveling up episode where I coach Cyndi, who is a German teacher in Idaho. Planning more cohesive lessons that flow more naturally and are connected to each other is the area where she wants to level up her teaching practice. So let's start the conversation. Are you a language teacher looking for some reassurance that what you're doing in the classroom is on the right track? Or maybe you're looking for some ways to teach even more effectively. If you're one or the other or somewhere in between, you've landed in the right place. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast with your host, me, Joshua Cabral. You're about to get tips, tools, and resources so that your students continue to rise in proficiency and communicate with confidence. Let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y. Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mes amis. Hola, mis amigos. And hallo, meine Freunde, because today I am speaking with a German teacher. So we practiced that before I started recording to make sure I got it right. But thank you all for tuning in as usual. I know that you're an incredible language teacher because you're taking time to listen to a podcast about language teaching, and in particular, listening to an episode where we are going to get into the trenches with a teacher, and she's talking about her teaching, and we are going to find a challenge area and figure out how can we work together to figure out what's the best way to address this to make our teaching even better. Cyndi's a German teacher in Idaho, and I have been really happy to have this opportunity to speak with a number of German teachers as I'm doing these episodes where we're talking about our teaching. And just a shout out to the wonderful work that I hear German teachers doing and I see that they're doing. So if you're a German teacher and you're listening, thank you so much. And I know you're doing such great work out there. So Cyndi, welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited for our conversation today.
So I mentioned you're a German teacher here in Idaho. Could you tell us a little bit about the context, what you teach and levels so that we can get a better understanding of that?
Sure. I teach in a high school that's about 1,000 students, give or take a few. And I teach all 4 levels, freshmen through seniors. The first and second levels are just beginning and intermediate. And then my German 3 and 4 are both what we would call dual credit, concurrent credit classes, where we work together with the local university to provide credit for students both from high school and college. And so I'm the only one that does German.
Mm-hmm. So you're in a situation where when you get a student and they take German for 2, 3, 4 years, that their German experience is with you. So could you tell us what that's like to have students over a series of years?
It's an incredible experience to see those kids go from freshmen to seniors and to watch them grow and change, not only as language students and their skills and their confidence, but also just as young people, to go from that kind of goofy, unsure, very nervous freshman to that very confident and, sometimes a little cocky senior, but well earned. And it's just wonderful having that every year. I don't face, brand new students in all my classes. I get to over half of my students, I already know them. And so that just makes the beginning of the year like meeting up with some old friends and having a reunion of sorts. I mean, I'm still their teacher, but it's just not as stressful as starting the year with, 100% new faces in front of me. So, yeah, right. It's really nice.
Yes, absolutely. I had the experience in a prior school. It was a grades 1 through 8 school. And I had sometimes students for their entire trajectory of 8 years when I was in the school. So really talk about getting to know students going from 6 years old to 14 years old. So I hear you. Yeah.
Yes.
So in some instances, it was like wonderful. And some instances, it was like, oh, wonderful.
Oh, yeah. Sometimes yep, exactly.
Yeah. Mostly wonderful.
Yes, you have to tell yourself that.
Absolutely. So let's jump into our conversation. And what is the area that you would specifically like to talk about? And I will just let listeners know that Cyndi reached out to me through email a couple of weeks back and said, can we get together? Can we talk about this, do some consulting about my teaching? And I said, sure, let's do it, but we'll do it on an episode. So if you're having a challenge area, I'm sure other teachers are too. So let's bring that to everyone. So Cyndi, why don't you tell us about what this area is that you're grappling with?
So what I reached out to you about originally was lesson planning. And one of the hardest things for me has always been to pull all the threads together, because language is so much of a, like I call it, my box of Legos. And I have to build this lesson every day with these pieces. And I need my interpretive piece, and I need my, all the pieces. You could name 100 different pieces. And it's like, is that something that should happen just every lesson, every time I meet? Let's call it a meeting. Every time I meet with them, is that like just a unique one piece of what I do, or is it really connected to all the other days and all the other things that I'm trying to tie together? And being that I have 4 different levels to plan for, I'm just scattered. And that's a little bit of my personality. Like, oh, look, shiny object. I could do this. Oh, I could do that. And before I know it, I don't know what I'm planning, because there's just so many good things out there. But I think if I had it's like a recipe. What ingredients do I need in that lesson every day that I should never, ever fail to have? And what are the things that I can trade in and trade out to just kind of make the lesson planning a little bit more, well, I guess just a little less jumbled. I just feel like sometimes I'm short on time, four different levels to plan for in 4 very different proficiency places on the scale. Is there a structure? Is there a scaffold for me? We talk about scaffolding for the kids. What about for me? Just to make sure that I'm hitting on all the good things and not just forgetting some of the really valuable things, which when you're stressed for time, oh, oops, I forgot to do X, Y, or Z. And so that's really what it is for me, lesson planning.
You use the word pieces, putting all the pieces together. Can we sort of name what those are? Are you talking about particular activities? Are you talking about the different modes? When you're talking about all these pieces, what are some examples of that?
So definitely the modes, that's like a good framework that reminds me, okay, I should be starting with the interpretive. I should be making sure that I hit on a number of those types of activities before I move on to the interpersonal. At least that's what my teaching, or what I've learned, the order of operations is. But it's like, well, how many activities are too many activities? Pieces are things that the students do, whether that's written or turn and talks or interpersonal, like a, partner sheet back and forth where they exchange information, watching a video, listening to something, doing just a raw listening. Okay, tell me what you understood. A lot of pieces. I guess it would be hard to say what they all are, but I think mostly it's less of what I'm doing that I make the decisions about. That's easy, but it's what the students are supposed to be doing. What should I never fail to have the students do during a particular day? And I don't know. I want to think of it like a recipe. Like I said, I want to make sure I have all the good ingredients, but then there are some things I could substitute chocolate chips for, whatever. So that's kind of, those are the pieces, I guess, if that answers the question.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And how long are your classes, and how many days a week do you see your students?
So we meet 4 times a week. 3 of those are for 50 minutes at a time, and 1 of those is for 90 minutes at a time. So it's a hybrid, what they call a modified block schedule. So we get 1 block period with them, which is very difficult because they're going 4 times in a row with lunch in the middle, 4 90-minute classes. So what feels like a traditional block day, but it's the only day they do. Well, they do it for 2 days, but it's the only day that we have them. So each teacher only has 1 90-minute block with them a week. And then the other 3 are the 50 minutes. And so the 90-minute days are hard. The students are tired, and those, because they only do that with each teacher once a week. I mean, they have 2 block days spread, out over the Tuesday and the Wednesday, but that's sometimes the 90-minute days are the hardest. And I'm more of the type to, okay, let's just keep cramming more stuff into the 90-minute day. And I don't know that that's necessarily always better. I mean, they want us to keep them moving and they want us to keep them busy, but 90 minutes, I take a break at the halfway mark with especially with my older advanced kids, not always with my younger ones, but that's more of a management issue. But yeah, so we see them 4 times a week, 3 times 50, 1 times 90.
That's good to have the context of that when we're looking at the recipe, because a recipe for 45 minutes and a recipe for 90 minutes, it looks like we're looking at the main course and then maybe some dessert. I don't know. I'm trying to make a metaphor out of food out of it, but just looking at the recipe could be different with the different types of time. So to ask you a couple of more questions as we sort of parse this out. So when you've sort of seen yourself in these moments in your class where you think, oh, this was not exactly the most effective in terms of the planning, like what does that feel like? How do you end up in that place with saying this isn't really working?
So usually it comes from not getting everything done that I wanted to. So I probably put in too many ingredients and then I end up with this really, awful casserole. And so then I feel like, okay, well, I didn't get everything done, so I must have failed somehow in the whole line of what was my logic in flowing through all this information with the students. And so then I get frustrated and I think, oh well, maybe it wasn't important, so then I scratch it off and I don't even attempt it, so then it kind of falls out. Or then I think, well, I better get it done tomorrow, and so then it's that pulling forward. So if I didn't get it done today, I'm just going to push it forward to tomorrow, but then it might not necessarily fit as well the next day. So that's the frustration is, I guess it wasn't a very good meal because I didn't get to all the courses. And so is that a failure on my part? Is that over planning? Is it? And sometimes the pieces are disjointed. So when I do put everything together, I think on paper, oh, this looks good. But then, as you know, when you go roll it out in your class, you're like, oh, well, that didn't necessarily connect the way I thought it would. So, and that's part of being a teacher.
Absolutely. Some of the best laid plans, and you'll hear another teacher who did this and you try to replicate it and your students and that day of the week, and it was the 90-minute block. There's always, the oven wasn't working that day and that's why the meal didn't come out,
Right.
So to kind of keep going with this idea of recognizing, so you're good at recognizing, okay, this didn't really flow or this did flow. So when you then go to your next class, like what were sort of some of those lessons learned from the previous class that you didn't want to replicate? Like what have you tried to do to address that issue of having those sort of disjointed classes?
I do learn from my mistakes. I don't think I'd still be teaching. I'm like you, I'm at year 26 or 27, I guess. I think sometimes I hope that it was just an off day. And so then I look at my lesson plans and I don't have laminated lesson plans. I mean, I'm willing to flex and change things from year to year. And sometimes you just come to something, you go, you know what? I don't like that. It doesn't work, or it doesn't get the result I'm looking for, or it's old and I'm tired of it and I need something to replace. But I think sometimes I just hope for the best and redo it. I mean, honestly, I'm that stubborn, but with four preps to try to figure out, I'm like, well, it worked well enough. I'm not super happy with it. And every now and then too, it's just the group of students you have and the mixture and that, like you said, that day, that week. So I mean, sometimes I might have them do less of a particular thing. Like I might scale it down a little bit, or maybe, not do as much of it. But it is really frustrating to just know, okay, which pieces do I take out? What ingredient can we live without? And what ingredient can we absolutely not live without? So, yeah, I mean, I don't know about you, but when I still write my lesson plans. I don't have like a digital. I'm happy on paper. And I know some people are like, lay it out on paper, on digital and have all your links and everything. I'm good enough, I think, on paper, but I do write them out. Like I can wing it pretty well. Oops, forgot to plan that. And, after that many years, you can pull it out of your hat and you can figure it out. But I think that I just don't feel good about what I've done. And so I think, well, I'll just do a little bit less. Like maybe the kids have done enough. And that's me. Anybody who knows me would tell you that. Yep, Cyndi tends to not overdo it in a bad way, but I'm just super thorough. And I don't want to be caught unprepared. If it's 90 minutes, I'm going to make sure I was trained, go bell to bell with the kids. And so that's what I do. So I don't know if that got to the answer.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That a lot of these questions are to give you an opportunity to look at your teaching and have a discussion about it to better understand and hone in on it. So every answer is the perfect answer. And
Okay.
so the last question I'll ask before we start to sort of unravel some possible solutions is, if you put your rose colored glasses on and you are seeing classes where you're not feeling like all the pieces didn't get done or it's disjointed, what would that class look like and feel like to you?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't feel so stressed to get through this list of things that I have. I would feel good about the flow from point A to point B to point C. So, what I had planned, I would feel had a good flow to it, logical flow. So, if the students are starting with something on the interpretive level, then the natural flow from that would be to an interpersonal, and I would just feel like, okay, this is a smooth movement here, and whereas right now it feels very disjointed. So
Mm-hmm.
that's what I would say. It's just like, this makes sense to go to this now. This makes sense. And what they just did makes sense to go to that next thing. And they're feeling that too. Like, I would pick up on their, oh, okay, all right. Like, I've prepped them well for each next step, and that there's not a lot of like, wait, you want us to do what? So
Mm-hmm.
they tend to be right there with me on the same page. That, to me, the rose
Mm-hmm.
colored glasses, not
Mm-hmm.
that, we teach with that ever happening, but
Right. Right.
in a perfect world.
So I would like to know specifically an example from you, because I'm sure with your 26, 27 years of teaching and all of these students that you've had many opportunities where you've had one activity flow very well into another one and that transition worked really well. Can you tell me about one of those? I'm sure you've had many.
So, like, just a couple weeks ago, I used a little AI help to get a story going that used stem vowel changing verbs. And oh my gosh, the students absolutely ate that up and they loved it. And so the flow from there then was the discussion, like, okay, I wanted them to read it, and they understood it, that it wasn't, so it was more of like the input where I'm giving them all sorts of repetitions, we used to say in the old TPR world. So the
Mm-hmm.
repetitions of all those verbs, and they absolutely loved the story, they understood it, and so it was a natural progression to go from that to, okay, let's write a sequel. So it was kind of a write and discuss. So I pulled the information from them with very pointed questions, and they just waddled along after me like the mother goose, and it just,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it was tremendous. And I don't know, it was a stupid story about penguins in a zoo or something, and some kids who
Mm-hmm.
went to a zoo. So I felt it was compelling to them, it was goofy,
Mm-hmm.
and those kinds of things. You've taught long enough, when they
Mm-hmm.
bite on when they bite on your hook, you know that you're going to be reeling them in all hour long. And that
Mm-hmm.
was that yeah, that one felt really good, and they seemed to enjoy that. So
Yeah.
that's where I felt like, okay, I planned this well. The continuum here on the line made sense to me, and it made sense to them.
So, in listening to you talk about your teaching, I zeroed in on a couple of things you said and themes that were really prominent in what you were saying. And I think that there's two ways of looking at this, and I'm going to use metaphors here. I always think that's easy to understand. The first one is this idea of a colander. And when you are draining something into a colander, all the water goes out and all the good stuff stays in.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's an opportunity with your teaching, with all the things, is to this idea of put your teaching through a colander and let all this stuff go out that isn't necessary. And what are those things that are really working well, and to
Okay.
keep doing them. And if that means that we have to have humble moments of, there are 7 of those 10 activities that work, even though we want all 10 of them. If for
Mm-hmm.
some reason with a particular class, they just don't do write and discuss very well,
Mm-hmm.
it just doesn't work with them.
Mm-hmm.
And then we don't force it. There are lots of other CI activities that you could do. With
Mm-hmm.
that particular class you just mentioned, that's something they could do. And so, yes, you want to keep doing it with that class. And I think that the frustration comes when we try to continuously use an activity or a procedure with students, and it just doesn't work for that group. And
Right.
there are lots of other things. So it's just this idea of put it in the colander, and the stuff that doesn't stay in, like, you don't have to go fetching that water that went through the
Okay.
colander. Like, keep the
Yeah.
good stuff in there. So like that's
I like
the
that.
one. Yeah, and it also, the stuff that stays in is that really, it's the stuff that's going to make you happy and proud. Like that experience
Mm-hmm.
you just talked about, that was a happy
Mm-hmm.
and proud experience. So
Yeah.
keep doing that with that class type thing, you know?
Yeah. During the pandemic, we talked about that. We use the word strainer, same idea as a
Mm-hmm.
colander,
Mm-hmm.
but because we had limited exposure with the kids and
Mm-hmm.
we were all looking at our curriculums and going, how am I going to take what I normally did in person? And when we went home in the spring of 2020 or whatever hybrid versions people
Mm-hmm.
had going into the next year, that, yeah, what's most important? And
Mm-hmm.
so I think that's probably a good reminder that
Right.
don't forget
Yeah.
that it's okay to let certain things run out of the colander so that you're
Mm-hmm.
not chasing after the stuff that just isn't as important.
Mm-hmm. And some of the things that stay in are going to go out for another class or another section.
Mm, okay.
And I know when we have a lot of preps, that's a little difficult to jumble at times, but it's not going to be sort of that one size fits all. And we're going to look at sort of the recipe you talked about, and we'll get to that. But I just wanted to, just a couple of other things I pulled out of when you were talking along that same way of looking at, what stays in the strainer or colander, is this idea of, do we go a mile wide or a mile deep? So do you
I
go
like
an
that.
inch wide and a mile deep, or do you do a mile wide, which means you're just going to cover so much content,
Mm-hmm.
and it
Mm-hmm.
feels like that hamster wheel of content. But if you get something like the story that your students latched onto, like, rather than saying, oh, okay, we're going to do another story, we're going to do another story, we're going to keep going, we're going to learn new things, keep that same story and go a mile deep with it. Do
Okay.
all the different CI activities, have them not just talk about it, write about it, do their own version of it. This is clearly a story that they like,
Mm-hmm.
and this is going to keep them interested, and you're on the same theme. It's still based on that same story. So that's going to help with that flow that you talked about. Right.
Right.
So it's that idea of, okay, once you find a topic that they're latched onto for whatever reason, like,
Mm-hmm.
go a mile deep on the topic rather than trying to like go wider with the
Wide. Okay.
content, and trying to like
Okay.
pull all this stuff in. I
That might
think,
be what my
yeah.
issue is that I'm likely to set the table for way more than is
Mhm.
needed. And so enjoy the meal, but don't feel like you have to have a taste of everything.
Mhm.
Maybe that's
Yeah,
a way to look at it.
and it allows you to bring in the modes, which you had talked about. Oh, can I get every mode in every class? And that's a question. Do you need to do every mode in every class? I don't think you do. I don't think you have to have everything every time. But if you're staying on the same topic, you can do it in different modes.
That's true.
And
Yeah.
rather than moving on to a new topic, and it's like, oh, what am I going to do with listening on this topic that we just read? But if you stay on the same topic and students are more comfortable with it, then you can maybe do something that has a listening component or a writing component. And because it's on the same topic, it's again going back to that idea of flow, and they're expecting it. Like, even if it's a totally different activity or something you're asking them to do, if they have this idea, if it's a new topic and a new activity, it's like, where did that come from? Why are we doing
Mm-hmm.
that? But if it's on the
Right.
same topic and it's a new activity, it's sort of like, oh, yeah, we're still talking about the penguins.
Okay. Okay.
you
So
know?
same topic, new activity versus new topic, new activity. I think
Yeah.
that's maybe
Yeah.
where I
Hmm.
tend to struggle.
I mean, I think that when you have students engaging with language, just leverage it.
Yeah.
And if it's a topic that's not working, then don't go so deep. Spend
Okay.
the time you need to and then move on to a new topic. But if
Okay.
it's something they're really latching onto, then get to all those modes and leverage it for all it's worth.
We do have to learn to read the room. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that's the days that go the worst is when I'm ignoring the room, but I'm ignoring the room because I feel like I have to get everything done. And
Mm-hmm.
then it's more about conquering my to-do list as opposed to
Mm-hmm.
maybe teaching. I mean, it's quantity over quality And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes I think I get lost in the quantity again because there's so many cool things to do. I have to say I appreciate the fact that I don't have laminated lesson plans. I'm
Mm-hmm.
okay at year 27 learning, being an old dog and learning some new tricks. I'm all right with that. But it's a lot of work. So,
Mm-hmm.
but it keeps you alive.
Yeah.
So,
And I also think that when you tend to go deeper on one topic, it helps students stay engaged just simply because of the cognitive load that it puts on them,
okay.
that they need to figure out how, like, what they're going to write about on that topic rather than it's a new topic and I have to find a way to write about it.
Okay.
Or I'm now going to watch a video on a different topic. And that takes a lot of stamina and that cognitive load piece, which cognitive load that comes from the whole pandemic as well and what we were doing with
Right.
students. And I
Yeah.
think I would not want to go back to the pandemic teaching years by any means,
No.
but I sometimes annoy my friends and colleagues when I tend to make lemonade out of all the lemons in my life sometimes. But there were such good lessons that were learned in the pandemic.
Oh,
Again,
yeah.
don't want to do it again, but there were so many great things learned. I learned to use technology in a way I'd never used before, and I'm
Me
thankful
too.
for that. I
Yeah.
learned to put the things through the strainer. I learned to go deep and not wide, and all of
Hmm.
those lessons learned. So I think that
Yeah.
we need to pull those, you know?
Yep. I agree. I agree.
Yeah. So now let's look at some concrete things that we could be doing. Although I think you're getting sort of a framework for what your classroom and teaching can look for a bit. And so the first one is this idea of a consistent daily lesson framework. And you had referred to it as a recipe earlier.
Hmm.
And I will ask you, you know your students and your levels. Do you think there could be one framework that could work for all the levels? Or is it better to look at levels 1 and 2 and then 3 and higher? What do you think would work better for you?
I think I could use one if it's very general and then adapt what I, for each level, need to plug in to that. I just wouldn't want my fear there would be, oh, well, if I go with one framework, I'm not maybe challenging the upper level kids as much. I
Mm-hmm.
don't know if that would be an issue, but I think that just popped into my head. Like, if I have this basic framework for ones and twos, is that enough for, or is that would it make those threes and fours feel like, oh, well, this is the same way she's always done lessons in one and
Mm-hmm.
two? Because there is, they know us, and they know our spiel and our song and dance, and so that's like,
Mm-hmm.
one of the downsides to, oh, okay, here we go, I know how she rolls. But for me, that starting, like, I have a couple things that I do very consistently. I don't know that I would call them the framework of my lesson, but for
Mm-hmm.
example, we always do a weather talk in German 1. I always start my day with that. We do a phrase of the week. With German 2, I do, as many students as I have, I do it's not the special person interview, it's my twist of the secret person interview, and then we
Mm-hmm.
reveal that on Fridays. So for my first and second year students, I definitely have a framework that I start my lessons with, but then after that, I lose the recipe card.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Well, I think when we're looking at this idea of a framework is not getting that specific. So
okay.
rather than saying, oh, every class I'm going to start with a calendar talk or weather talk or a special person
Hmm.
interview. And when you label it that, that is going to be your go-to. But I would think of it more as segments of your class.
Okay.
So you have, say, if it's your 90-minute block is going to be a little different than your 50-minute block. But with the
Right.
50-minute block, I would sort of look at it in like 3 15-minute segments.
Okay.
And for each segment, have 2 or 3 options of what you're going to do in that time. And when you
Okay.
start from there, like, oh, okay, so at the beginning, it can be the same if it's level 1 or level 4. In level 1, you have 3 options. You can do a calendar talk, you can do a weather talk, you can do a special person. You have those 3 things. And then for your level 4s, there's another 3 possible things you can do, but you're not reinventing it every time. And you
Okay.
could even set it up that like every Monday is every Tuesday is but it's not necessarily the same thing, because
Okay.
depending on the topics that you're covering in your class, one might lend itself better. Like if you're
Okay.
reading something has nothing to do with weather or climate, then that's not a flowing transition. But if you want to start every day with that and it doesn't flow into the next thing, maybe that's why. So maybe you
Okay.
think, okay, this is an opportunity to do in that first 10 to 15 minutes a special person interview. And since we're talking about food right now, we're going to focus in on food and talking to the special person during their questions on their interview.
Okay.
But then if you're talking about something that has to do with activities or what students are doing outside of school, then
Hmm.
absolutely do the weather talk there, because then you can
Okay.
talk about what activities you do in the different weather. So it
Okay.
keeps it as it's a framework, but not so specific. It allows
Okay.
for 2 or 3 things to happen in each one, and then looking at that for each segment. So the second one is either going to be something with listening or something with reading, or if you've already done that in a previous class, then this is going to be either an interpersonal or a working on a project. So again, having 2 or 3 possibilities that happen in each segment so that it keeps it not so defined, but
Hmm.
it's also going to keep you from over planning because
Well,
you're only going to
that's
have 3 things.
okay. Okay. And that, I really like that. I am very scattered. It's part of being the creative brain, just doesn't, I'm not a rows and columns person. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's something I've always struggled with. And I love the creative stuff. So it makes it difficult
Mm-hmm.
to make those choices. It's kind of like, I want the dessert before the meat and potatoes part of the meal.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm disciplined enough that I know I've got to get the meat and potatoes on the table
Mm-hmm.
at some point. But that helps with a 50-minute to just
Mm-hmm.
break it down, think of it in 3 chunks, and then
Mm-hmm.
go through that if it's 2 to 3 options, and that does streamline it. What about for the 90-minute then?
Well, for the 90-minute, I'm looking at as sort of the gift of time.
Okay.
So if you're having a break in the middle where you've already determined we're breaking in the middle. So for one of them, I would do your regular class routine and have the other 45-minute time that's in there after your break, or if it's 40 minutes, depending on what it is, like
Hmm.
have that be a time where they are engaging in a different way with the language. Because again, that cognitive load and that stamina that
Oh
students are
yeah.
keeping up with, right?
Right. Yep.
So, and maybe that's the time where students are working on an ongoing project. That's where
Okay.
students are doing free voluntary reading or bringing something like that into the class so that it's not 90 minutes of being on for them.
Right.
And you can
Right.
flip it. That could be the first 90 minutes and you do the typical class the last 45 minutes of the
Hmm.
segment. But
Right.
it's just finding, like, make that time a special time that they actually kind of look forward to. It
Okay.
could be sort of like your cafe speaking time, where this is where we just engage with topics and we just talk about them, or they bring in things that they want to talk about, or like show and tell, or whatever that looks like for them.
Okay.
That
Okay.
it's like those specific topics. And if you have a lot of curriculum to cover and that's not possible, then I would just segment that other 45 minutes the way you're doing the other classes.
Hmm.
But if there's a way of giving them an opportunity to just enjoy the language and have it be a time in their week where it's not an assessment time, but it's a time where they are being in conversation circles or doing movie talks and things like that, are a little more involved than the other ones. But
Hmm.
I'm just thinking like cognitive load wise, because I
Right.
talk to a lot of teachers about how they're planning those long blocks,
Yeah.
and it can be exhausting for students.
Yeah, and it is for
Yeah.
us too, because the
Mm-hmm.
pressure is to make good use of the 90 minutes. That was
Mm-hmm.
the whole idea when they sold the block schedule to us when we originally had the A B block. that, oh, you can go so much more in depth. But what a lot of us found is that the students' cognitive load ability just didn't follow that. And it hardly
Mm-hmm.
did, I think, for the adults in the room, too. So that is definitely a consideration. And so I think framing
Mm-hmm.
this and saying, okay, let's look at it as on a 50-minute, 3 15-minute segments, that's easy to mentally kind of for
Mm-hmm.
me see. And then on the 90, just thinking of the first part as essentially another 50-minute
Mm-hmm.
segment, but then using that remainder of that 90-minute as something, maybe just that's what we always do on that particular half
Mm-hmm.
of the block day, but
Mm-hmm.
maybe make it something that releases, that it's not so much of a heavy load. Like I
Mm-hmm.
thought of something when we were chatting about, oh, last week on Thursday, we didn't have school Friday because we had parent teacher conferences, but my third year kids were in a unit on how I live and apartments and, German students and how they rent apartments and all that, furniture and all those things. And one of my favorite end of the unit activities is to do the role play. And so they had to play the roles of either a prospective tenant or the landlord that had the apartment to rent out. And they absolutely hit those out of the park. They love those role plays. They do
Mm-hmm.
such a good job. And I always tell them, not everything that we learn to say will always be scripted for us. And so that ability to handle unanticipated language. And so I had to, because it's an uneven number of students, so I had to jump in and play one of the roles. And so I was a tenant looking for an apartment, and I had a pet elephant, and they died laughing, but they had something they could
Mm-hmm.
respond with. And those, when they just, like you said, I take a grade for it, but it's basically, did you participate? You're good. I'm not,
Mm-hmm.
checking boxes about verb endings or anything like that. I just want
Mm-hmm.
you to speak. They just run with those, and those are so fun.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe I could just make, the second half of my 90-minute day each week, let's role play something and give them
Mm-hmm.
the choice of, what do you want to role play? I mean, we try to
Mm-hmm.
keep it kind of practical, but there's a lot of creativity in those kids. And I mean, I can see some of the crazy stuff they could come up with. If I can harness it and get it to go in the
Mm-hmm.
direction that would be to my liking as well, then more power
Mm-hmm.
to it. But
Yeah.
is that kind of what you're sort of suggesting? Is
Yes, and as you were talking about that, it's also going to lend itself to a lot of spiral review because they're going
Mhm.
to end up using a lot of language or needing to revisit vocabulary that's from previous units that
Absolutely
don't naturally come up in your 45-minute classes and in your segments, but in
right.
that moment, like give them a topic where they have to talk a lot about colors,
Hmm.
and so it's not just the colors but the correct form of the colors. Are they in the right
Hmm.
case? Are they,
Yeah.
so that they have to keep practicing those things which aren't going to come up in the unit about the environment. So
Right.
those ideas, it's like this perfect time to do that like spiral review in there in kind of a clever tricky way that they don't really
Yeah.
realize, but
Right, right. Yeah. I'm getting
you know
better at that. I don't remember which of your many episodes. I think I've listened to everything, but remembering that far back, you probably don't remember half of what you said either, right? It's the part of being a teacher. You have to remind yourself what your name is half the time. But I do know that we do have to be sneaky about pulling those things back in, because
hmm
the classic flow of the language curriculum is, yeah, we learn to say hello, hi, how are you? My name is, and then we don't ever do
hmm
that again, except at the
hmm
beginning and the end of the class. And yeah,
yes.
so I think that would be a good,
Mhm.
like a good target for me to look at, is like, all right, what am I going to do creatively that is going to take the load off but not leave them with nothing to do the second half of that 90-minute. So I
Okay.
like that.
Well, excellent. So, if we now try to harness this into a bit of an action plan for you, so I would say I like to have a this week. Like, what's something
Okay.
you could actually do this week, and then we'll look at ongoing things. Because I think when we have goals, if we don't meet at least a part of that goal in the next 2 days, then it goes on a shelf. So
Yeah.
like let's look at like what could that be. So I would say that start by for yourself framing that, okay, I'm going to have 3 15-minute segments,
Mhm.
or I'm going to have 2 20-minute segments. I mean, figure out what that's going to be. It might be
Okay.
3 15-minute segments for your lower level classes, and it's 2 20-minute segments for your upper level classes. Like, so the first thing is to figure out which one of those frameworks is going to work best amongst your levels. And then for one of them, not all of them, because remember, this is a quick for this week, figure out what 3 possibilities are for the first segment of your class.
Okay.
So figure out in your level 1 and 2, what are my 3 go-to activities? And you could probably come up with 5 to 10 go-to activities for that, but don't go there yet. Start with 3
That would be me.
and harness that. Yeah, so start with 3 and harness that. Do the same thing and try that. Try that out. Get comfortable with it. And then as you're moving forward, then look at the second 15-minute segment and then the third and figure out, okay, this is what those can look like. But start with the beginning. And because setting that routine and doing it for like 2 weeks, then you can start to see, okay, this works. And that the motivation to look at extending that to the others will come from there. But if you try to do it all tomorrow, it's still going to be overwhelming and disjointed and all of that. So start with that 15-minute, what is that going to look like? What are my 3 possibilities? And try to cycle through them. Does that feel like it could work for you?
It does. It really does. And I think that's probably what has been my issue, is just too many things. Like if I showed you a picture of my lesson plans, it's a little box for each hour and it's just bullets of this, and this. And so there's not really like, there exactly that. There's no frame. There's no frame around that. And I think that will definitely, I think it'll make it less, like I won't feel so overwhelmed, just to kind of say, okay, here's just work within this frame and everything will be okay, hopefully. So I like that.
Yeah. And I think also by labeling it 15 minutes or 20 minutes, then you're only going to do activities that take that amount of time. If you don't start by thinking of the time, you're going to plan activities that could possibly take 25 or 30 minutes. They might get done, they might not, and then you get frustrated with the way it's going or there are too many questions. But if you figure out as you're going, also time things and say, okay, that's a 10-minute. Oh, that's a 20-minute. What do I need to change about it to make it 15? And don't be afraid to say, this is a 2 15-minute phase activity. This is a 30-minute thing. And you just, but then you plan for both of those segments in the class and don't say it's going to happen in one. And then when it doesn't happen in there, then we get frustrated and then we get to the next thing. So like actually label that and say only so many hours in the day, right?
Right. And that's absolutely where I've been frustrated. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'll look up and there's 30 minutes gone. I'm like, I never expected that to take 30 minutes. And sometimes, like I said, read the room, it's going well and you don't want to discourage, you don't want to stop that flow. But if that's what frustrates me, then I guess I have to do something to kind of tame that, rein it in a little bit. So and I just wasn't trained that way. So
yeah, and I don't think a lot of people were. And as you look at those activities and you say, oh, okay, this is a 25 to 30-minute activity. And so when I plan for it, it is happening in segment 2 and 3. And that's it. That's all I can plan. I have my opening 3 possibilities. I have a 30-minute, and that's my other 2 segments, and that's it. I'm not planning anything else. And then when you find the ones that are 10 or 15 minutes, I can do 2 of those. And the more you start to actually plan and document how long they take, I know it sounds like very scientific way of teaching, but it helps you to stay within that framework.
It does. And then that way I feel more confident going into my lessons because I know, okay, I'm doing this then, I'm doing that then. And I know that will be helpful for me. I mean, I know that it's hard when you get to the years of teaching where we are. I know what I'm doing. It's not that. So I told a friend or 2 of mine, I'm like, yeah, I'm going to be interviewed for a podcast. And they're like, really? Like, you don't know it all? I'm like, no, I'm bearing my soul here that I can teach really well, but planning has just always been the bane of my existence. And so just to be able to put something around it and say, why don't you look at it from this perspective? That's very motivating. So I'm looking forward to actually planning, which I would never say.
Well, that is so so good to hear. If I got a teacher who's excited to plan, that is great.
Just to have control over it, I think, is the main thing. Yeah.
That is wonderful. Yeah. And have you downloaded my CI toolbox that I've been talking about? Yeah. So if anybody who's listening, if you don't have the CI toolbox, the link is in the show notes. And it's a PDF that has 15 activities, CI activities on it. And most of them are 10 to 15 minute activities. So you can actually use that as the different things you can do within the segments.
And if I remember right, you actually put the number of minutes that takes on each one, right?
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Right.
See, and that's I should only be looking at activities that people suggest that actually have a time on them so that I can know, oh, that would fit here or that would fit there.
Well, Cyndi, this was an absolute pleasure. And I love that once we get into the flow of the conversation, I started to see you get excited about planning. And as typically happens, when you just have, 45 minutes to sit down and talk about your teaching and to think about your teaching, you end up sort of figuring out so much of this stuff. And so I love having this opportunity for teachers to do that. And you had mentioned that, it takes some humility to do this after teaching so many years and to talk about our teaching. And that is a model for all of us. So thank you very much for having this conversation. And as I say all the time, if you are thinking about this with your teaching, other teachers are as well. And so having this conversation was very, very helpful for them. So thank you so much, Cyndi, for being here. We'll be in touch. I will send this all to you in some notes, and I'll reach back out to you later on in the year to see how things are going. But thanks so much for being here.
Well, thank you so much. You are an absolute, treasure to the world language community out there. And seriously, there have been times when I'm like, what am I going to do? And how you rethink your teaching, and you just are that steady rudder, just keep doing this and do these things. And it's just amazing what you've done for all of us. So thank you too.
Much appreciated.
What insights or inspiration did you take away from that coaching session? If you want to dive deeper into your own teaching practice, consider joining me for a Leveling Up episode. Just click the link in the show notes and we can set it up. You'll also see a link while you're there for Talking Points, my weekly email newsletter with tips and resources for language teaching. I will talk to you soon. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to the World Language Classroom podcast. Be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so that you never miss an episode. Let's keep the conversation going on social media. Connect with me on X, aka Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at WL Classroom. And for even more valuable resources, visit my website, WLClassroom.com, where you'll find over 300 blog posts about language teaching. So stay inspired, keep growing, and continue making a difference in your language classroom.